Welcome to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif. And Arif, housing prices are up 50% in just the last 2 years. We're starting to see kind of a calming cooling off of the market. Hopefully that stays. I have a feeling that may be short-lived, but we shall see. It's just anybody's guess at this point. We do have a provincial election that's coming up. We've got
June 2nd, yeah.
June 2nd. And I think we talked today about where some of those responsibilities lie for the state that we're in, with the high price of housing, the lack of affordability and availability. We've touched on this in previous shows, and that ball keeps getting kicked back and forth between the municipal government, the provincial government, and the federal government to a degree as well.
Well, I'd like to remain a little bit consistent, Mike, and suggest that again, nothing works in a vacuum. Yes, housing prices have gone up 50% in the past 2 years. So is the price of a liter of regular unleaded or gas in general.
Literally doubled in value.
Commodities have gone up. Now here's the thing. Let's put some things in perspective, though. We also are seeing reports that suggest that the profits taken by the large grocers, namely the Loblaw Corporation, is reported as up 40% in recent months. Certainly. The cost of the inflationary things that we're seeing on the sticker price, you just wait a month or so until the earnings and the reporting come in. And I said it a couple weeks back for sure when it was first announced that the interest rate were going to rise. The Bank of Canada was going to set the new rate,
and are going to continue to creep up.
My prediction is that the banks, counting on the average person, the average Canadian, not to do too much homework, and we just take it. We take what we're being fed. I assure you that if you look at the third quarter earnings reports by the major banks, you will see again record profits there. And there is definitely some opportunity being taken by
and it drives me crazy, because here's what I don't understand. You've got a federal government, you've got the Bank of Canada, and they look at a housing market that in their eyes is out of control, and they think, okay, if we raise interest rates, that's going to quiet the market. Quieting the market will ideally bring affordability back into range for some people. But if you bring the price of houses down 10%, but you're raising interest rates on the mortgages for those homes by 7 or 8%, then nobody has any financial gain other than the lending institution. So basically, you're taking profit away from the average Canadian homeowner who wants to sell their house for top dollar and is possibly going to see the value of their house deteriorate a bit. So you're taking that potential income from them and putting it directly into the hands of the big banks. Tell me how that really serves the Canadian public best.
Well, it doesn't serve the Canadian public best, and again, Mike, I'll repeat it one more time, nothing operates in a vacuum.
No.
So while we are seeing housing prices that are reaching new heights, remember back in 2017 when the sky was falling and the market went crazy, and everybody said, I better buy now and I better pay over asking by $200,000-$300,000 or 10, 20, 30% over asking price. Otherwise, I'll never get into the market. We saw a correction shortly thereafter. There are people, and I know some personally, who literally found themselves upside down or underwater, however you want to put it, for a period of time. Now remember, like in the stock market or anything else, you only win or lose at the time that you cash out. Right? And so for those who found themselves living in a home that wasn't worth what they paid for it, wait a minute, and it caught up.
But I would, my observation there is as well, if we look back to 2017, it was early January, February, where we just literally overnight saw this rush of housing prices going up. And by May, June, they'd come back down. So it was a quick blip. But what we've seen over the past 2.5 years has been more gradual. It's been a steady increase and a steep decline or incline, but it happened over a longer period of time. So I think it's had more time to entrench itself. And so with that, I believe that the likelihood of us dropping back to pre-2000 prices is very low. We may see adjustments that might shave 5% off the top end, but if your $400,000 house in 2019-20, hit $800,000 in January, and now it's gone down to $750,000. You didn't lose $50,000. You're still far ahead of the game on the big picture.
Here's what's going to happen. First of all,
you heard it here first, folks.
There are too many elements at play, too many variables, that there is not one single thing that's going to sink the housing market. For example, there are people out there right now who are saying housing values are going to lose 25%.
Yeah.
Compared to what? Against what? And I think that's what you're talking about, right?
Against itself.
Against itself, or against, it depends. Canadians are very good at reading headlines, and you know, I love my neighbor. Just as I love a family member. However, we have to start training ourselves to go beyond the headlines and actually put aside some of our emotional reaction. Right? We tend to be emotional people. We tend to react, and we also tend to follow trends. The only person winning is the first mover. So for example, when COVID hit and we were in lockdown, we made a suggestion pretty much 2 years ago today that said, listen, you're not going to go to Disneyland this year, and that money that you've been saving up for your trip to Europe, you're not going to spend it this year, so perhaps invest that in your home, improve your curb appeal, build a backyard oasis, do a home renovation, fix your bathroom, make it a staycation, put in a pool, have some fun in your backyard.
Very words we spoke,
right now at that time was the right time to do it. And that is when commodity prices were still, you know, on a level, in balance. And the price of lumber and the price of hardware, et cetera, was reasonable.
Yeah, it was reasonable.
Now, I would love to believe that everybody across Canada watched Hitting Home with Mike and Arif and went and did that, but they did that. They went and invested, and that's what people did.
Many did.
But those who waited 3, 6, 9 months to get started were the ones who were buying when plywood was $100 a sheet.
And that's human nature. We see it in the stock market. You see a stock run up, and most of the purchases are just before the curve flattens and starts to go down, and then everyone, or a certain segment, will panic. I think a lot of people are rushing right now. We're starting to see inventory levels go up, and there's a lot of people going, well, I don't want to miss my opportunity to sell at that high price. I can do it now, and if it's on the way down, then I'll buy again as it's going down. So that's bringing more inventory into the field, and homes are accumulating on the market because they're taking longer to sell. We're seeing a quieting of buyers, and I think it's for a few reasons. I think chiefly a number of the buyers who intended to buy in the last few years have bought. A lot of homes have sold in the past 2 years. So that pool of buyers is probably, waning a little bit. That's not to say there's a big generation of people who the next group will be right behind them to buy. And I think the demand for local homes will continue. You've got all those seniors and empty nesters who want to get out of the city, who want to get away from that big city life, who like the idea of buying a home that's $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 less than what they currently pay for a home, or what they could currently sell their existing home for. That temptation to come to the region will continue on. But the problem is we need the product here, and that we need
the product, Mike. We do need the product. However, again, humans are going to do what humans do, which means that nobody is going to panic. There will always be somebody. You aspire for a balanced market, but a balance is something that's very fragile. Right? You put a little bit more on one side of the scale or the other, and you're going to get it to tip. So while we may be aspiring for a balanced market,
it's more like a wave pool that just kind of goes back and forth.
Exactly, and there are, as I said, there are so many elements at play right now. You've got your gas prices, you've got the dollar sitting where it is, you've got inflation at an all-time high. There is the perception that the economy is strong. There is the perception that the jobs market is strong. 1 month's reporting at 5.2% is not necessarily a realistic number. Again, remember, at Christmas time or leading up to Christmas, we have the lowest unemployment rates in the country. But wait for a month after Christmas, and suddenly we have the highest unemployment rates in the country. You've got to look at data beyond
how stable are those
snapshot in time. Exactly. The numbers aren't stable. So when you've got interest rates rising, to your point earlier, when you've got interest rates rising, we said this on the show probably 4, 5, 6 months ago, we are in an sustainable place right now where interest rates are the lowest that they've ever been. And they're at the lowest that they've ever been for a period of time longer than they've ever been
seen,
that low. We should have been into a recession 7 years ago if you look at history. We're now, what, 14 years into a typical 7-year cycle. We're going to go in that direction. We will, and it's being manufactured. When I say it's being manufactured, all of the policies and decisions that have been made by policymakers, levels of government, are working their way towards that. The goal towards cooling the market is their effort is being done by raising interest rates. We've already said this, though. People who made decisions based on the unrealistically and artificially low subsidized interest rates to buy more home because they thought they have more disposable income, they can carry the home better at a lower interest rate, they bought more home. But when those rates go up to where they're going to go, there are some suggestions that they're going to go towards 7%. I'm not going to say you're going to see mass hysteria, you're going to see challenge.
And that's why many, including myself, balked at the stress test when it was put in a few years ago. Looking at it now, I'm sure a lot of people who got a mortgage, who qualified through that stress test to buy their home, are probably in a better position than some who may have bought a home without that stress test in place. With the interest rates going up when they go to renew, hopefully that stress test has created a buffer for them that they can work within. So
I was not a fan of the way the stress test was rolled out. I'm still not a fan of the way the stress test was rolled out, because when the rates do rise, that stress test still remains in place at contract rate plus 2%. However, somebody knew what was going on. Somebody knew that the rates are historically and artificially low, and they're going to correct at some point. And we are in a position as Canadians, and maybe perhaps North Americans, that is so fragile. And when I say so fragile, we're literally flirting.
We're close to that tipping point, do you think?
When household income does not keep up with the cost of goods and the cost of home ownership and the cost of life in general, and we are artificially subsidizing our livelihoods, absolutely. There is literally the proverbial straw that's going to break the camel's back. And when we're going to go to break shortly, Mike, I'm sure. But when we do come back from the break, I want to talk about our lack of preparedness. And really, we can talk about headline items all the time. You can talk about wedge issues all the time. As you mentioned, we're going into an election. There are going to be things that they're talking about at the door. One thing I promise you that nobody's talking about, and they haven't talked about it, so why would I believe they're going to talk about it, is the most important thing that they should be talking about.
Let's touch on that and a few other things when we come back from the break.
Well, let's leave that then, and leave people hanging for that in suspense. Let's go to break real quick, Mike. But on the other side, we'll pick up the issues, and we'll keep talking about what people should be talking about, which is making sure that we're in a healthy position to weather whatever's coming next. But stay with us for more of Hitting Home with Mike and Arif on the other side of the break. Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif on Rogers TV. And Mike, before the break, we've been talking about, the fact that we are going into a provincial election on June 2nd. Actually, we didn't touch base on this today, but we will shortly thereafter be going into the municipal election cycle. And for the benefit of our neighbors, try and keep track of who's knocking on your door with what literature when.
Conservative leadership race nationally.
There is a leadership race,
Will we be tired of political talk?
What do you mean, will we?
Summer?
What do you mean, will we? I'm sure people are
Some
already.
people love this stuff. I have a short window of attention
of
on
enthusiasm
it.
on it?
After a bit, it just gets, because it's like Groundhog Day. You hear the same stuff over and over again.
I'm glad you mentioned that. You heard this. You hear the same stuff over and over again. And let's talk about what we predict they will be talking about at the door. And don't worry, I haven't forgotten what we left the last segment on. But
it ties in.
But you know that the low-hanging fruit will always be, and you said this yourself, it'll be what? Education, healthcare, and housing. In a broader sense, the economy, but within that,
housing affordability.
They've slowly started to bring in the term housing availability as opposed to just housing affordability in the last year or so.
Well, they need to, because they're directly tied. one is causing the other. And they've tried to keep them separate. And what you talked about with the stress test, why the stress test frustrated me, not that I didn't think it was good, responsible measures economically for us, was it was introduced as well, let's do this. This is going to be the answer, this is the solution.
The magic antidote.
This is an as well, not instead of. And they just put that in there thinking that was going to solve things. No, this was one component that you can do in addition to the primary one, which was create the housing stock that we need in Canada, and that's something that, I don't know, it's deliberately avoided, but it's certainly ignored.
Well, you know what? We as fellow Canadians only have ourselves to hold accountable, and that is we want to elect people who are going to do what we want them to do, not necessarily what we need them to do, because it's inconvenient sometimes. And, you know, that's a pretty bold statement, and somebody's going to send me hate mail at some point for that, and that's okay. I still stand by it, right? And it's what I believe in with my children. It's what I have to practice with myself. I know I fail sometimes at that. You know, sometimes I'll go out and purchase something spontaneously that I didn't budget for, et cetera, and then you deal with it.
Yeah, exactly. And let me say, and not to protect any one party or anything, but you do see the posturing, not just from the leaders and the politicians during the election, but from their base. And you see it on social media. But I suggested it to you when we were having coffee earlier, is that right now, the incumbent is a Conservative government, so they'll be being criticized that they could have done more for housing, they could have done more for education, they could have done more for the economy.
I have a thought on that.
But if you switch those out, and it was an NDP leader in there for the last 4 years, or a Liberal leader in there, you would still be saying they could have done more, because it doesn't matter who's in power, and it doesn't matter what they're doing, there's always more that's going to need to be done than can be done.
Well, if there's one thing you can count on, those also the electorate has short memories.
Well, there's
traditionally.
That is
here's trusting that they don't. But typically speaking, those who are knocking on doors are counting on people to have short memories.
Yeah.
Some of them are. Let's put it that way. But let's get into that, because you're right. There is no antidote. One single item that's an antidote. There are so many things that are at play, and so we talked about the fact that you're right, Mike. I mean, education can always and should always be improved, and it should be, because times are constantly evolving. We shouldn't have an education system from 100 years ago, et cetera, still being the prevailing model today. We need to constantly update our practices and our policies. However, housing availability and housing affordability is something that transcends both, let's call it all levels of government, because at some point somebody's connected at one level of government or another. But typically speaking, the policy is set by the province, and the if you will, the implementation is done at a municipal level.
Yeah. And I have some issues with that.
Okay.
And it's based upon what I'm seeing. I mean, I moved back to Barrie 22 years ago. I make a point to try and watch City Council Monday nights, excuse me, when I can. Probably more than a lot of people, more than is probably healthy, but I do. And I got to say, and I'll just put it out there, needs to be said, this past term of council, I have had more reason to yell at the TV screen. I've been more frustrated with what I've seen than I have in any time in those 21 years. And I think if 1/4 of the energy that has been put towards the personal attacks between the people around that table, if 1/4 of that energy was put towards trying to resolve our housing issues, I think we'd be in a far different place right now. Not to mention a number of the policies I've seen that are deliberately and intentionally been put there to stifle housing growth. And I could name them. I've named them one at a time on previous shows. I'm not going to go into that. That's not the point here. But it leads me to the hypothetical, should the planning approval process be taken out of the hands of the municipalities that are maybe too close to the fire, have too much bias? They have a constituency that's divided between those who are comfortable, who have owned their homes for a long time. They don't want to see that new development in their neighborhood. They're the ones that are showing up and saying, not in my backyard on Monday nights, and they're the ones that City Council tend to take their cues from. There's another big portion that's a little quieter, but they're more significant, or as significant, and that's the millennials, the Gen Xers, the people that are moving out of the city up here to retire, and that need that housing stock, that need to see Barrie grow. A provincial government, if they were looking after that planning approval process, or a little further removed from it, would they do a better job of that? Would we see more housing stock within Barrie? Maybe we wouldn't be comfortable with some of the decisions there, but overall would we be in a far better place right now?
So the question that I actually have is, going forward into an election, if you were to choose your ideal candidate to sit around or to become the elected official sitting around the table, what would that person do?
Yeah.
How would you describe their role when it comes to planning and approving development going forward?
We're talking a municipal?
Sure. Yeah,
okay.
municipal.
At the municipal level,
yeah.
I would say we need to be more open to, be willing to have broader shoulders to take that flack that you're going to get from people who don't want to see Barrie change, who in their mind they still see Barrie 1975 when it was 36,000 people, and they think it's a crime and a sin that we're as big as we are now. You can't have a city council that takes a development proposal from 200 units down to 100 units or 150 units. We were recently speaking with a representative from the city who's talked about, well, we have 20,000 plus approved units that have gone through the process. They're approved, that aren't getting built. Why is that? Well, I have some ideas on why that is.
Do you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Part of that is they're sitting back waiting for that next council, as you pointed out, and in hopes that they might be able to revisit this, because they came in there with their plans, the numbers worked, they were going to put 200, 250 units, whatever it was. After the back and forth of the council, the final approval comes through, and it's 2/3 to half of what they originally set out to do. Now the numbers don't work. So now they've got their approval, but for something far different than what they originally set out to do with their business plan. So they sit back and they wait for the economy to change. So there's a lot of those.
You're absolutely right, Mike, and I think one of the things that would be helpful is if again, we as the electorate were informed beyond the headlines.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that is, I think, relevant and needs to be noted is that much policy, including the zoning and the bylaw, et cetera, is outdated. It's outdated the moment it is printed. Whether we're anchored back to something that was created in the 70s, 80s, or the early 2000s, or even if it was an amendment that was updated a couple of years before. Again, if it's in print, and if it's not a moving, fluid document that cannot be, amended day by day, then it is outdated. So,
and that's the policy, and democracy was designed that way, to be a fluid, to be evolving and reshaping. It was never meant to be constant, carved in stone.
However, when you have somebody coming to council, when you have a planner or a representative for an applicant coming to council, they know that they're coming in with an ask that will be looking for exceptions to the current bylaw, zoning law.
Yeah.
All right.
What is
the permitted use?
Yeah.
The permitted use. And again, Mike, we've seen this depending on whether we are looking at an aging population that will need to see more bungalows and more purpose-built homes versus 2 stories, or whether we're going to be looking at, well, what happened during COVID, and do we want to see more congregate setting, like condo or multi-unit settings, or do we want to go back to detached? Because again, there was a huge push away from detached as being unsustainable. It's not the best use of land. How do we address the population? The term is crisis. I don't know whether it is an actual crisis or not. It depends on who's asking. The reality is we've got anywhere between 300,000 and 500,000 new Canadians that are slated to come in year over year going forward. They need somewhere to live. We've got a supply issue. As you said, there are 20,000 units that are sitting without shovels in the ground. You're right. It is a business case. At some point, unless we're living in another part of the world where the law of the land is a lot more socialist based, there will always be a business case. As long as the world is depending on some private entity or corporation, if you will, to make an investment and to put a shovel in the ground and to finance the development, as long as that's the case, then there needs to be a return on that investment.
Yeah.
And with the price of commodities and supplies and labor going up, you've got a strike, by the way, going on down in the GTA. I believe they're voting on strike action for looking at increased wages in the trades right now, in the building trades.
Okay.
So obviously these are all things that add up to what is my cost to build per square foot.
You tell me, someone who's been in the trenches before as a city councilor, do you think the process, the system, the way it is set up, the approvals process, do you think it should be left alone? It's as good as it needs to be? Do you think what I suggested, perhaps it needs to shift responsibilities to the province? Or is there a hybrid maybe where we, both parties could work closer and better towards that goal of creating?
I will tell you exactly what I think, Mike. I think that as a member of City Council, we should know what our role is and know what our position is, and we should get out of the way of certain things. For example, there are certain lines of business that we shouldn't be in. So the city should be in the business of providing services to the community. Those services are transit, environmental, water, wastewater, snow removal, and things like that.
Infrastructure.
And infrastructure. And where we run amiss, if you will, is thinking that we're planners, thinking that we are developers, thinking that we're the business community. Cities and governments aren't, and they shouldn't try to be, and they don't know what someone's books are. So you're absolutely right. If there are 20,000 units that are sitting waiting, they may have been approved or not, but they're not shoveling the ground. Well, they're not shoveling the ground for a few reasons. Building materials are too high.
Yeah.
Right? So they're not going to do it. They will wait it out, and they will make sure that when they put a shovel in the ground that they can get out of it alive. Because
those numbers were high even before building materials went up in price.
They
so
will wait for a new council. They will lobby and they will support a councillor or a candidate who is going to help them attain their goals. That's what they're going to do.
Yeah.
But here's where we're also wrong. Thinking that growth will pay for growth is absolutely wrong. Because it hasn't happened, and it's not going to happen. And here's what needs to happen.
World thinking.
There's a different school of thought, Mike, and that school of thought is build it and they will come.
Yeah.
There's another school of thought that says, and it stands the test of time, in order for anything to be successful, certainly of a large undertaking, right? To have a successful outcome, you cannot sort of throw caution to the wind and wait for it to happen. Somebody needs to take charge. Somebody needs to make an investment, and somebody needs to plant a seed.
Yeah.
And in order to make that investment and plant the seed, from a municipal and a planning perspective, the taxpayer is the investor.
Yeah.
Not the mayor,
understood.
not the councillor. And let me finish my thought.
Yeah.
The taxpayer is the investor. The last thing the taxpayer wants is to see 20,000 new units built and then a city go and start to widen roads or build the roads or build a community center. We, as investors, want to see a return on our investment and make sure that we have a healthy, functioning, sustainable model. And there's good debt versus bad debt. And good debt would be putting the infrastructure in the ground. Yes, you're going to pay a little bit of a percentage rate to carry the cost. The taxpayers, the investors, will cover that. So put the investment in the ground, build the proper infrastructure, build the proper roads, build the proper transit, put the community center in, put the library in, and make it a place that people and businesses want to come and set up shop. And they will do that.
I know, and I couldn't agree with you more. And a little bit of a history lesson on how we got there. You go through the 70s, 80s, and 90s in Barrie, where we went from a population of 35, 40,000 to 100,000. Much of the growth, much of the development was taking place without that infrastructure commitment.
We're living, Mike, through an era right now where they didn't do the proper infrastructure, and we're now going back to town rebuilding roads.
We're having to build schools
at a 3x price, probably. We got to go to break. I'll let you pick that thought up. I want to give it to you, but we do have to go to break. Stay with us for more argumentative, combative, banter, or whatever you want. Not argumentative, but fun banter. I don't know who we're yelling at.
Just blowing off steam.
Blowing off some steam, absolutely. But we'll be right back after this break on Rogers. Thanks. Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif. And Mike, we're getting into some opinions on, what should the candidates be saying and what should they be doing. You asked me a question, obviously, or I think I asked you a question and you threw it back to me. Mike, if I had my way, I would get away from let growth pay for growth. Yeah. We've seen it time and time again, Mike, where to appease somebody at the door, or to appease people in the moment, to preserve our job as an elected official, we do what we think the people will want to hear. Yeah. But time and again, I'll ask it as a question. When was the last time you heard that waiting a couple of years that it would be cheaper, that the price of labor would go down, that the price of materials would go down? It never works that way. It never works that way. So you end up paying for it twofold, threefold, add to it frustration. Yeah. Right?
What people think they may be saving by the developers paying for their growth, it ends up, that cost comes back to everybody anyways. And growth pays for growth was the mantra that came about after, like what I was saying just before the break, is there was that long period of growth in Barrie where we weren't building the schools, we weren't putting the parks in place, we weren't putting the libraries and the infrastructure in, we were building the houses, and the government decided, well, we need to charge the developers up front for those infrastructure improvements that are going to be needed so they can be done at the same time. And they've stuck by that, and the costs escalated, and in addition to that, the province downloaded a lot of responsibilities and costs to the municipalities over the last 30 years as well. So developers have been saddled with this, and as you say, we are the investors, all of us are shareholders in this city, and we should share. You can't just, ideally it's nice to think, well, the developers can pay for that, but what's the result? We see less product being built, and we see housing prices driven through the roof, and that impacts all of us. So we need to take a share, and I think we need to revisit, should growth pay for growth?
Well, Mike, we have an artificial set of numbers, and we have an artificial set of goals and ideals that we want to try and show people at the door. When a politician says, I don't think the people will pay for it, they're wrong.
Yeah.
Here's why. People will pay when they believe they're getting value for their dollar. Yeah. People will pay when they believe that they have an improved quality of life.
Yeah.
And if you want to test that theory, and if you think people think that they're broke, there are still people going through drive-through several times a day, getting their $5 coffee filled with all sorts of different things.
Macchiato,
whatever it may be, and I'm not knocking anybody who want to do that. People decide what their priorities are. Yeah. So anybody who's saying, listen, I can't afford the price of gas, but they've still got one of those premium drinks in their hand. Yeah, well,
here's where some of those cost rebounds come in. You talk about quality of life and being impacted. It's a direct correlation with the social issues that we do have. And those social issues are taxing on our city council. They spend a lot of time trying to tackle and deal with those issues, a lot more time lately than we've ever seen at any time in the past, and a lot more actual financial costs for dealing with and tackling those social issues. So if you're not putting everything in place to have a healthy, full-rounded community, you can expect your social issues and challenges to climb, and you can expect the costs for dealing with those to climb. And if you're not dealing with them, it affects your economy in other ways, because you have people, you have industries that decide, I'm steering clear of this area.
Let's remember who a politician is. Whether it's at a provincial, federal, or municipal level. And remember, a municipal politician in this particular case is my next door neighbor, right? It's somebody who is living in my community, who did a good job at presenting themselves at the door with their literature, et cetera, and said, I will be your effective, responsible member of council. And then we vote for that person. And that's what should happen.
On personality alone.
Yes. Well, it might very well be, because all too often we don't say, can I see your resume? Can I see what you're an expert in? We don't do that. Perhaps we should, but we don't.
We think about it through the course of those next 4 years. Perhaps we should have.
We do think about it later, but again, this is a system. Perhaps. This is the way the system is. I'm suggesting, when I say that politicians should get out of the way, it is simply because if you take 11 people around the table, there's at least 10 of them who are not planners. And sometimes you wonder about the planner themselves, right? But when you see somebody saying, we sure showed them, we canceled that greedy development or whatever it may be. Well, wait a second, let's go back.
You're going to have a little chorus line of cheers for those decisions.
Let's go back and look at what are our priorities. Our priorities are that we have a housing supply, we have an affordability issue, we have an availability issue, and we are in a city that has been designated to grow. We're along a 400 series highway, we're going to grow. We have rapid transit and mass transit, we're going to grow. We're making investments of hundreds of millions of dollars in healthcare, and we're a regional hub, we're going to grow. So if those around the table can keep that in mind as they have applications come forward, then the question to the developer or the applicant might be, how are you assisting us in achieving our goals and our priorities, which is ensuring that we have availability, we're ensuring that it works with transit, it ensures that we have the parks and services, and I don't see that happening.
No, and let's give them a break and take the thumb screws off our municipal representatives for a bit and shift back to the province.
Absolutely.
Again, we've got the election coming up. We're listening, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of promises made between now and June 2nd that haven't been made yet. What would you like some of those promises to be with regards to, well, maybe even anything, but with the extra consideration for housing and affordability?
Well, I think a dose of reality would be in order. I think that anybody knocking on the door, yes, absolutely, as you said earlier, quite rightly in the earlier segment, Mike, that we will want to continue to improve access to healthcare, continue to access improved education, and improved education probably should include a more stable environment for delivering education both in person and online. Because we definitely tested that model out. There were flaws. Or there were challenges, if you will, and it's likely going to consider thinking that if we're going to continue to see people working remotely in the corporate world or educational institutional world, we're probably going to see people continuing to learn remotely. Some people will thrive in that environment. Some people absolutely did not thrive in that environment. So I think that has to be taken into consideration as far as education goes. As far as housing and availability goes, again, back to the basics. It may not be fun to talk about, but we do have an issue with migration, whether it's immigration or migration internally or interprovincially. And as the world again continues to embrace the fact that we can work remotely, then our priorities are going to need to be updated in terms of making sure that we have access to infrastructure. Being high-speed internet should be something that is a talking point, making sure that high-speed internet is available. Because if we can spread the density and the concentration of people who are currently in these high and intensely populated areas, if we can spread that out a little bit, then and a province can do that. A municipality can't do that. A municipality or a town can only work in their local area, but a province can look at the bigger picture and say, how do we sort of ease the burden in these concentrated areas?
They're becoming a way that the groundwork for how that will actually play out is still ahead of us for the most part. But and I've talked about it before too, is a vast number of the resources of the provincial government, the administrative, all of that, is concentrated within the GTA in the Toronto area. And it was set up there originally for a legitimate reason. When, with these businesses literally communicated by courier back and forth, paper being shuffled and shifted around, we're in a whole different world now. You don't need to be side by side for the convenience of that closeness. We can take a lot of those the provincial resources, and we're talking tens, if not hundreds of thousands of employees in Ontario. We can spread that out to different communities, and I'm sure a lot of those employees that are working there now would be more than happy to move out of Scarborough or Etobicoke, where their homes are $1.5 million, and go to one of those communities where they can buy that home for half the price. Their life would be far better getting out of the city. So to say that we need to, because that's what the people want, is not true anymore. That we need to for financial and economic reasons or convenience, it's just not true. We can break that down, move that out. I think we also have all those brownfield sites still within Ontario where the province can do far more and put some funds towards having those reclaimed. Look at Bradford Street. I keep going back to it in Barrie as just one example of prime land that could be redeveloped for residential that just sits year after year after year after year, and that's happening throughout the province. So
I think, Mike, we see a government that has said, well, we see two parties right now posturing, saying, I'm going to spend $10 billion moving people by building infrastructure as a highway and moving people. And I think that is much needed. I think that there's another party that is saying, I'm going to take that waste and I'm going to put it into schools and education and refurbish schools. I would remind that candidate and that party that they had 16 years in government, and the one thing that they did was they shut down schools. They did not invest in Central. They shut Central down. They did not invest in infrastructure. They shut schools down. They shut classrooms. They let schools fall into a great state of disrepair during their 16 years. To say that they're going to stop the waste on the highway and put it into schools, I don't believe it, because if they were going to do it, they had 16 years to do it, and they didn't do it. Instead, they moved children an hour and a half by bus each way because it was easier and cheaper and less responsible to actually invest in the school. So I would say, going into an election year, I would want to see healthy investments, just like we talked about before. Don't wait for growth to pay for growth. Put the money in, invest it, reclaim the brownfields. Just think about the amazing things you will do for the environment. You would clean up the environment, and you would allow for healthy downtowns, to have a populated downtown that is bustling, where the residents would live within walking distance to downtown. They might bike to work, they might take transit, they might do whatever, but they will create a thriving environment where they could support the stores and the proprietors that were on the main level of their condo or their multi-unit building if they were living in the downtown. So that is what I would like to see a province do, is to invest in gentrification and revitalization projects.
And maybe put the I won't call it pressure, but encouragement to a higher degree towards municipalities to do the same.
Absolutely. And so the question, we got to go to break again, Mike, surprise, surprise, but one of those questions that still goes unanswered is, can we leave it to the municipalities, not just ours here, in municipalities in general? Can we leave it to them to make these unemotional but logical and intelligent decisions based on facts and evidence? Or do we have to consider going to the province to do that? And I'm sure there will be locals who don't like the fact that there's somebody downtown in Queen's Park or in Ottawa making decisions for our neighborhoods. Too often it ends up in that arena anyways, with the process the way it's set up. So
we do have to go to break. We're kidding ourselves to say.
Yeah, you're right. When we come back from break, though, Mike, I want to talk about one thing, and that is personal responsibility, and something that hasn't been talked about and probably won't be talked about at the doors during the election. But stay with us on the other side of the break for more riveting conversation with Mike and Arif on Hitting Home on Rogers TV.
Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, and once more, Arif and I are solving the problems of the universe, our little corner of the universe anyway. The two things that I'm taking away from today's show that that have stood out for me is the notion of whether or not the province or the municipality or some hybrid of the two should be having that power and control over the municipal planning and development process. I guess a shorter way to put that is, could that be revamped? Could that be fine-tuned in a way that's going to be of benefit, that's going to see us having a quicker, more efficient process for approving houses? And the other side of that, the other question that came up was whether or not growth should pay for growth. Should the developer be responsible for the full cost of infrastructure on any of the developments they bring forward, or should all of us collectively as a municipality be participating in that process with the assurance that we see a healthier community, we see better infrastructure and more systems in place to make us a healthy community?
Well, Mike, I do see a way forward, and I see a way forward that allows municipalities to retain their oversight and their hand on the planning of their own communities. I think it would be really unfortunate to lose that proximity and the ability for
their input
a bunch of mature, responsible adults to make the right decisions for their communities. So I'd like to see that. What I would like to see, and the way forward that I see, is better training for those who hold positions of responsibility and make these decisions for our communities. That they're not just for a 4-year term.
No,
there are plenty of there's a sufficient amount of damage that can be made in 4 years, and that is for life. That is for 100 years, if not longer.
And planning and policy should be not based on the 3 people from a neighborhood who are upset about the walkway leading into a school. If I may touch on something recently, you need to step back and remember the big picture and who you represent, and that is all of Barrie, not special interests and not just those who scream the loudest.
So the role of government and people being elected by your peers to be a representative is so that you put your faith and trust in that person to make decisions that are what's best for the whole. Best for the whole, not for a special interest group. And I understand. Listen, don't get me wrong. I understand.
There are pressure and temptations there.
Sure, and I also understand being the neighbor who doesn't like what's happening next door to me. I get that as well. But as you mentioned earlier, this is not Barrie of the 1970s. Anybody who thinks that it is hasn't been paying attention, because, as we talked about before, it was decided a long time ago that this community is slated for growth. So, Mike, if we've already decided that it only makes sense that we continue to evolve our practices in education and in healthcare, it also makes sense that we continue to evolve our practices in municipal government, in provincial government, in federal governments, and as well with planning. So my suggestion is a better educated member of council as to, what are the priorities. You don't just come in and on your first day in office and say, I'm going to change how things have been done around here. Watch me. It's you need to know you need to know the last 20 years.
City councilor doesn't come in thinking that.
Well, yeah, you need to know. You got to put the superhero cape away, but you need to know what's been going on, and you have to pick up and respond. And that doesn't mean you're not going to make some course corrections, the appropriate course corrections. But it's important for you to, for each member around the table to understand the consequences of decisions and to understand what the overall plan is. So I do think that if some of those people who decided to be activists instead of advocates or representatives of, maybe have a second look at what is responsible government.
It's not the platform.
It isn't the platform, and there is a place and there is a time for activism, an appropriate one that I support absolutely wholly.
Oh, for sure.
However, if we're going to do what's in the best interest of the corporation of the municipality of the city of Barrie, which is what it is as a director, and we're going to serve all people, and we're going to understand that there are protocols that come from senior levels of government that suggest that we are going to grow, then we need to take that in mind. We need to take that in mind and how we're going to lay that out. So now, that doesn't mean I'm pro-development. There is so much development out there that I am not impressed with.
No. Well,
there's a lot of garbage out there.
You do need someone monitoring and overseeing and keeping the best interests of the population in mind.
Absolutely.
Because I've seen crazy propositions brought forward. I've seen good ones that have been overlooked or
there are some who come in, they build the lowest standard that they can possibly get away with. They take the premium because the housing prices and the demand is through the roof, and they walk out and they go do the next development. I would like to see better standards on that.
It's a lot of weight on the shoulders, both at the municipal and the provincial to a degree.
Yeah, there's a development locally that just got approved that is, another retail commercial spot on Mapleview, which I don't understand. Why? And it's minimal stories. Why aren't we building along a transit route that has ground floor commercial and or professional space with residential over? We could have had affordable-ish housing for the seniors community, those who don't need or want to have a garden.
The neighbors spoke up, and rightfully they were feeling inconvenienced by the proposition of this in their neighborhoods. They put pressure on their councilor, or the councilor spoke loudly on their behalf. And what was to be more like what you just envisioned there ended up being what it's going to be. And that's too often the process.
Here's the thing, Mike, we're gonna be tight here. The one thing that I wanted to get to on this show before we go to break, it's something that we're not going to hear about at the door that we should, is that household spending and personal spending is through the roof. It's out of control. And the one area that the regulators and the politicians are not talking about, they're talking about mortgages and the banks and increasing interest rates to 7% to try and curb inflation. Listen, if we got the predatory lending practices under control, if we went after the credit card companies by legislation, if we went after the payday loan companies by legislation, and if we went after the don't pay a cent events, which are ridiculous. It's don't pay a cent for 6 months, but we know you're not going to make your payment, and therefore when it does come due, you're paying 32% interest, retroactive for the first day, fully compounded, and the writing of the contracts is such that nobody
appliance
understands
and furniture stores do it.
The regulators have allowed this to perpetuate, and if we wanted to put our fellow Ontarians and Canadians in a better position, then we would be monitoring and we would be protecting ourselves and our neighbors from these predatory practices.
I agree wholeheartedly.
And things would be in check. People need to pay attention to their spending, because right now, I said it a few segments ago, we will go into recession territory. We will have people who struggle more than ever. It's because they were unprepared and they didn't lay a good, solid, healthy foundation.
We need to protect those who are at risk currently with everything you've just mentioned, but we also need to go back to the classroom, and we need to educate our younger people in dealing with that going forward when they step out into the world, and we don't do a good enough job of that, for sure.
We don't.
We're going into our final segment now, which is the Good Citizen Award, which we've looked at a few people here, and we tend to look each week now as we're closing out the show at those Barrie residents who are deserving of a bit of a spotlight because of the work they do within the community, and often it goes unrecognized, and oftentimes those who are doing it, they're not doing it for that recognition, but we're going to make them uncomfortable anyways. This week, it's on a sad note, but I'm going to turn it over to you.
Absolutely. So the person that we're shining a spotlight on today is somebody who spent their entire life in service, and literally their entire life in service. And we're sad to share and continue to pass on the news of the passing of Will Dyer. And Mr. Dyer, he was a World War II veteran, and he served his country and the world, protecting and preserving democracy and for the best interests of his fellow neighbor his entire life. But not only was he a World War II veteran, he continued to pursue the public service by, himself having endured and overcome cancer, but he raised money for Terry Fox, for the Terry Fox Foundation.
And lived a long life, too.
Absolutely. And during his time, 4 decades, 40 years, he raised over $1.2 million for the Terry Fox Foundation.
That's incredible.
And he did it by cycling, and he did it by smiling and just committing to doing his part.
Yeah,
absolutely. So
a good
on that note,
for all of us.
Yeah, an incredible example. So on that note, though, we do extend our condolences and our thanks to the Dyer family and all who knew and loved Will. And I think that's where we'll leave it today. But
yes.
So, Mike, on that note, last thoughts?
Well, that was great, Arif, and it was a great show. We've covered a lot of territory here, and with this election year at the municipal and the provincial level, there's a lot for all of us to consider and think about before we go and cast our ballot. And
I think that is the key.
And cast our ballot. And certainly housing affordability and availability should be ringing loudly in the ears of those candidates, and I hope it is.
Absolutely, and folks at home, I mean, now is our opportunity. We deserve who we have representing us, and I certainly entrust and believe in the fact that we should do our homework, and whether that's the homework of getting to know who the candidate is, or to study on and decide what's important for us.
Sure.
We get to make these decisions, and we live in an amazing country that allows us to make these decisions. People fought and died, as did Will Dyer, so that we can make these decisions for ourselves. And
exactly.
I think we shouldn't take that lightly. So do your homework, folks. That's our PSA for today. Do your homework, and make sure you're comfortable with the decision that you're going to make on who's going to guide our province and our city going forward 4 years at least, right?
Yep.
So we'll see you again on Hitting Home. Thanks for joining us.